So I showed you one Civil War Vault book, and now here's another one that I have. It's called The Civil War Experience, containing rare removable documents and memorabilia by J. Works. And here's the back of it. That's the author. And this shows you some of the things you can expect to find. When you pull the book out, it has the title on the spine, but the rest of the book is photographs, very close-up photographs. This is, I believe this is the dead of Gettysburg, and there's some soldiers in front of a mortar. It's a very nice book. It has a glossy cover. On the inside cover, we have a sort of, not quite sepia, but almost a burnt orange in pages with a really detailed, exciting battle scene from a painting. And then we turn the page and we see some zouaves, that type of uniform with the fezzes and the sort of Persian look. They were called zouaves. And we have some helpful keys in the table of contents. And then the introduction is The War That Made America. And we're getting a little bit more background information. The Union dissolved. Here we see Fort Sumter and a Columbiad cannon shooting against the bombardment from the Confederates. A little brief bio of Abraham Lincoln. That's, by the way, Major Anderson, who was the commander of Fort Sumter. Jefferson Davis. And then there are some pull-out items here. So, one of the pull-outs is a copy of a telegram, front and back. And this telegram is talking about the status of the fort. And here is a part of the Charleston Mercury, which has been blown up a little bit, but it's an extra. The Union is dissolved. Passed unanimously at 1:15 p.m. December 20th, 1860. I'm going to put these two enclosures back in. Now let's turn the page. Obviously, one of the most important causes of the Civil War was slavery and the abolition movement. And this chapter talks about that, including John Brown, Frederick Douglass, Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner was a senator from Massachusetts, and the debates about slavery became so intense in the state in Capitol Hill that Preston Brooks from South Carolina, another senator, beat Charles Sumner with a cane on the Senate floor. This is the execution of John Brown. He led a raid on Harper's Ferry. He wanted to free slaves in the South. Now we get to the beginning of the Civil War with the Battle of First Manassas, or you might also know it as the First Battle of Bull Run. Confederates and Union armies generally named battles differently. For example, the Confederates referred to the battle as Manassas. The Union named it Bull Run. The same, the Battle of Shiloh was also called the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing. The Battle of Antietam was in the north was called the Battle of Sharpsburg in the south, and so on and so forth. They It shows different geographical features to name the battles, depending on what side. Here is Civil War forces and strategies, and there are some items to look at. This is a very nice thing you could hang on your wall. It's a recruitment poster. United States Volunteers, the Union Guard, accepted by the Secretary of War, July 26, 1861. And this is like something you would see if you were, walking down the street. This would be on the wall. It was basically a poster to join this regiment. It tells you who's in command, and maybe if you were, if you lived in this neighborhood, you knew these people. This looks like a letter here. This is that letter. Robert E. Lee's resignation from the U.S. Army is what this letter is. And he explains his resignation in this. He was originally offered full command of the Union Army by one of Abraham Lincoln's guys, and he turned them down. I think he sent one of his political allies. I can't recall his name at the moment. Here is the road to Shiloh. Now, some people say Shiloh was the first turning point of the war because Shiloh was a lot of things happened in that battle in 1862. At that time, one of the most promising generals in the Confederate Army was Albert Sidney Johnston. He was killed on the first day of the Battle of Shiloh, and seemingly the momentum of the Confederate Army also died on that day. And he was succeeded in command by General Beauregard, who made some poor decisions and held up the army, which allowed time for General Grant to arrive down the river and regroup the Union Army, and then the Union took the second day. This also was the emergence of Ulysses Grant, which became probably the beginning of the end for the Confederate Army. Here is a contemporary picture of the Battle of Shiloh, which is just very great. This type of primary source is just very cool to see. So this is what the battle looked like from one of the observers, one of the people who participated in the battle. Wallace's 11th Regiment Illinois Infantry, and I'm not sure if this was Lew Wallace or the other Wallace. There was a Wallace who died at Shiloh, and there were two. They weren't related to each other. The watercolor painting was by Private Fred Ransom, and it doesn't specify which Wallace. I'm sure I could find out if I looked at which regiment it was. Here is a military telegraph. See? And the telegraph is to the Secretary of War, Stanton. And they're just describing Shiloh as a victory near Corinth, Tennessee. It's in the envelope, which makes it very cool. So I'm going to put these two enclosures back in. And also on the pages, we see some pictures of General Grant, of the battle, and here's a 12-pound Napoleon cannon, not named after Napoleon Bonaparte, but Napoleon III. There's a little misconception about that. On the next page, we talk about the war out west. Henry Sibley. If you ever seen the movie The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, if you have, they mention and even have someone playing him in that movie. Because The Good and the Bad and the Ugly is supposed to be taking place out west, New Mexico, Arizona. The battle where battles like Glorieta Pass and so forth occurred. The Henry rifle, early repeating rifle, a bit more expensive than a Winchester, but the Winchester obviously became the standard Western repeating rifle, but the Henry was the earlier one that actually was invented during the Civil War. I believe in the movie Dances with Wolves, Kevin Costner's character is armed with a Henry rifle. The other repeating rifle that saw action during the Civil War was the Spencer carbine, but it was much different than this lever action Henry rifle. The War for Mississippi, simply put, control of the Mississippi River was very important during the Civil War. Mississippi divided the East and the West. Mississippi River was a way to transport supplies and men quickly. So whoever controlled the Mississippi, it was, had one of the first stages of winning the war. We also see some pictures of ironclads, and the Navy went from sailing vessels to iron warships during the Civil War. Benjamin Butler, they called him the Beast Butler because of when he took New Orleans and how he some of the corporal measures he made as the military governor of New Orleans. This is the Peninsula Campaign. The McClellan, who was the commander at he was appointed by Lincoln to command the Union Army after the defeat at Bull Run. Bull Run, the commander was General McDowell, and Lincoln was disappointed with General McDowell's performance, so he appointed McClellan. McClellan was a very good organizing general. He was very good at discipline, applying training and he was great at building an army. He was an army builder, but he was reluctant and almost scared to send his army into battle. His men loved him, but he was not winning the war. Later on, he actually was running against Lincoln for presidency. Here's the alternative at this time was General Robert E. Lee, who was the superior battlefield commander over McClellan with his team, including Stonewall Jackson and other famous generals. Here we see a British Enfield rifle, very similar to the Springfield rifle that the Union used that was made in the U.S. The Enfield was made in England, and England was somewhat supporting the Confederacy during the Civil War. Oh, there's an attachment here. I hope I didn't miss any. Okay, this is a letter written by Stonewall Jackson. Harper's Ferry, 1861. I guess without reading the letter, the interesting thing to take note is the very precise handwriting, and he was an interesting guy. Stonewall Jackson, a bit of a hypochondriac. He also refused to fight on Sunday. He did a lot of odd things. He sucked on lemons during the battle, or he would raise his right arm during battle. He to keep his blood levels the same. Interesting. Here's a chapter about spies and espionage. Rose Greenhow was a famous Confederate spy. They even made a movie about her, like a made-for-TV movie. Alan Pinkerton, standing next to Abe Lincoln here. The Pinkerton Detective Agency eventually became the Secret Service. That's the Confederate Cold Wheels. the Confederate campaign for Kentucky. There's General Braxton Bragg. He was considered one of the lesser Confederate generals. Oddly enough, there's a fort named after him, and it's still an army fort, which is kind of strange. The Battle of Antietam, another kind of a turning point battle, was Antietam. This was the technical Union victory that predicated Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which was a political move to keep England from aiding the Confederacy. England was very anti-slavery, so the gesture of freeing slaves in the southern states was a way to keep England out of the war. So it was purely a political move. It did not free slaves in the border states, which were states that slavery was permitted, but they were not in the Confederacy. So it's been criticized a lot as a political move rather than a moral move. But this also shows that Lincoln was about pragmatism. I think if you consider, you may fault that, but if you consider how hard Lincoln pushed for the 13th Amendment, I don't think there's any doubt about his character. I just think he was a pragmatist at that time, but he ultimately chose to do the right thing. When it wasn't popular to do the right thing in many cases. So that is courage. Here is a telegraph about complaining about George McClellan's tendency to overestimate the number of the enemy and not use his army. And something to the effect that Lincoln said, if McClellan is not going to use his army, tell him I'd like to borrow it. But he did eventually remove McClellan. This is Special Order 191, the so-called Lost Order. Let's see. This doesn't look like it. Oh, hold on. These documents are not looking like what they say they are. The enclosure tab here. Now, this is the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay. This is the telegraph. So this is supposed to be Lee Special Order 191, but this is clearly Arlington, Washington City. This is not a special order. Well, yeah, it is. General Winfield Scott, Commander of the Army. Sir, this is not. This is actually Lee's dismissing himself from the Army. They switched the attachments. That first attachment we showed a little bit earlier was the Special Order 191 that was captured. So they have the documents mixed up. That wasn't me. That was the makers of the book. Not good. Yeah, he wrote to Winfield Scott and said he wanted out of the Union Army. He didn't send Special Order 191 to Winfield Scott. I can assure you that. So, it's always a little distressing when you find a mistake in a book like this. And I can't get him back in there. Okay. There we go. Life of the Soldier. This is really cool because it just has candid pictures of camping. Matthew Brady, who took pictures. Matthew Brady, now we talk about how Matthew Brady took pictures of soldier life, but really he was famous for taking pictures of dead soldiers and bringing the war to people's living rooms and possibly, almost causing Lincoln not to get reelected because it made the war so unpopular. That's what he's really known for, but I think history has softened his image a lot. War so terrible, Fredericksburg. That's General Butler. No, I'm sorry, General Burnside. General Burnside was another one of the lesser commanders of the war. He charged his troops at Marye's Heights. The Battle of Fredericksburg were only to be mowed down by the Confederates who held positions there and it was a just terrible loss of life. And I think that has really made his statement. It is good that war is so terrible, otherwise we would like it so much. So, hospitals and medicine. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you might have seen my 1908 medical book. So, as you know, medicine has come a long way since the Civil War, but at the time, with no antibiotics, very little in the way of painkillers or antiseptics, when diseases were killing more people than battle wounds, diseases like dysentery, it was a sad state for medicine, and the germ theory hadn't really been put into place yet. So oftentimes even medical doctors didn't understand the nature of germs or sterilization or things and how germs were spread and infection. So, you would have surgeries and amputation with bare hands and without proper cleaning of utensils or sterilization. You would have people dying of diseases like dysentery that could have been cured with kaolin and the dirt. Of course, hindsight's 2020. They didn't know because they didn't know, and it's not fair for us to judge them for things that just hadn't been discovered yet. But this is what's in a USA hospital knapsack, and we can see the sort of things the doctor carried, like chloroform, which was a way to knock somebody out, adhesive bandages, opium, quinine used to treat things like malaria, tinctures, different types of topical treatments, shaving brushes to shave before surgeries, bandages, binder boards, medicine glasses, lamps, lint, matches, pins, silk, soap, spatulas, sponges, tourniquets, tape, lead wire, scissors, needles, thimble, cotton case. I mean, it just that was their equipment. Surgeon's General Office. Their attention is called on the requirements of Army Regulation, paragraphs 1157 and 1164. It was about returning property. When we think of the Civil War, and we get this from many movies and so forth, is amputations. The crazy number of amputations. Well, that was because they didn't have a sufficient way to treat bullet wounds or many other wounds of the limbs, and the life expectancy was higher just by removing the limb. The Battle of Chancellorsville, that's where General Jackson was killed by friendly fire. Here's the Spencer carbine that I mentioned earlier. That was an early repeating rifle. Here is the cavalry. Some famous cavalrymen. Nathan Bedford Forrest, Judson Kilpatrick, Mosby. What do we have here? This is Army of the Cumberland. This is Septimus Knight's diary. And you have some pages to read of his wartime diary. This is very cool. Gettysburg, Campaign at a Crossroads. That's Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, General Meade. Gettysburg was an invasion by the Confederate Army of the North. The armies met around Gettysburg, and General Buford, I believe, was the first Union army to intercept the Confederate forces under, I think it was General Hardee, or not Hardee, but it was one of the Lee's brigadier generals. They started fighting around a college. Then Union General Reynolds came for support, and the fighting continued until all the armies met up. And it was a huge battle, the biggest in the Western Hemisphere at the time. It ended with a bad strategical decision by Lee to charge several columns of his army across an open field against entrenched Union troops. That was called Pickett's Charge. Just annihilated these troops, and Longstreet never forgave Lee. Pickett never forgave Lee. They thought it was just a terrible. Lee never forgave himself. It was just a bad move. I don't know what he was thinking. So it was a terrible battle. Gettysburg, the high water mark of the Confederacy. Yeah, that was the Confederacy peaked and it declined after Gettysburg. Yet the war would still go on through the rest of 1863, 1864, and then all the way through April of 1865. So, but I don't think there would ever be an invasion of the North like that again. This is Colonel Avery's note. It says, this note was penciled by Colonel Isaac Avery as he lay dying on East Cemetery Hill after leading his North Carolina Brigade in a charge against the position held by the Confederate 11th Corps. The note, stained with Avery's blood, was recovered by a fellow officer. It's hard to read. I can't. I wish they had actually translated it because it's very difficult to read. But this is the Gettysburg Address. And as you can see, it's widely believed it was written on the back of an envelope, but it was written on one page of executive mansion paper, letterhead, and one page of different kind of paper. So it was kind of written on the fly, but not on the back of an envelope. Okay. Now we're talking about the Coastal War. The ships, we talked about that a little bit earlier. The naval history of the Civil War is not studied nearly as much as the history. I mean, obviously it wasn't as far-reaching as the Inland War, but it is nonetheless very interesting. Very first submarine. Great quote, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." I mean, there was a lot of naval action, a lot of bombardments, a lot of blockades. There were blockade runners on the Confederacy that traded supplies with England. There was a lot going on. It was is a personal thing, but for some strange reason, I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but the ship that was sunk by the submarine, the Hunley, was called the Housatonic. That is, to me, such a haunting name. I don't know why, but just the name of that battle, that Union ship. I don't know. Some of the names just, you could almost, like, for lack of a better, to articulate how it feels. Some of these names are so archaic sounding, you can almost just smell the age on them. It's interesting to think about. The Vicksburg campaign it coincided with Gettysburg time-wise, and this was another thing that put Grant on the map as a great general. He actually earned he'd already earned the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant for Forts Henry and Donelson, but once again in Vicksburg, he was instrumental in taking that city, which is a very important port in Fort City. Here we have the Daily Citizen newspaper. that was printed in Vicksburg. But look, it was printed on wallpaper because they were so short of supplies. And people in Vicksburg had resorted to living in caves and eating mule meat and stuff. It was really, really rough. This is a declaration of loyalty. So if you were, if you surrendered with the city, you could fill this out to pledge allegiance back to the Union and try to spare yourself some punishment. We get to Chickamauga and Chattanooga. We're getting towards the end of the war. Burnside again. A Sharps carbine. If you've seen the movie Quigley Down Under, he uses a modified Sharps rifle. War on the High Seas again. Colt Navy, famous pistol. Wild Bill Hickok, Carradines. A lot of Clint Eastwood movies. This is the weapon you can choose. It's a very cool looking pistol. The Wilderness in Spotsylvania. This is the point of the war when it's just getting into just bloodshed, and the 2 years after Gettysburg it went on just were 2 years too long of just hideous murder. Some Confederate money. Here's General Grant's commission to Lieutenant General, which was the highest rank at that time. No full generals in the Union Army under the Confederate Army. Sherman's campaign for Atlanta. That was where they burned everything down and salted the fields and twisted the railroad tracks, and he handed General Abraham Lincoln a early Christmas present in the city of Atlanta, so he said. Sherman's march to the sea, fighting against Confederate commanders like John Bell Hood. Here is song lyrics for the March to the Sea, written on graph paper. And President Lincoln, I beg to present you a Christmas gift for the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns, plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton. From General Sherman. Another dispatch to President Lincoln from General Sherman. So I was incorrect. It wasn't Atlanta, it was Savannah. He gave as a Christmas present to President Lincoln. Now we talk about terrible prison camps. Andersonville, Elmira. The prison camps were terrible during the Civil War. I visited Andersonville, and this is one of the newspapers that the prisoners actually made and circulated amongst themselves. They tried to have some normalcy, by having ads for barbers, and very interesting read. The Prison Times. U.S. Christian Commission, letters about the prison conditions. Point Lookout Hospital, letter to a daughter, and James Jameson. the experience of the USCT, or the United States Colored Troops. This was talks about you might have seen the movie Glory, which is highly fictionalized, but tells the story of the African Americans who served in the Union Army during the Civil War, and the great lengths that commander Robert Shaw went to take them to battle to prove that they should be treated as equals because they were willing to contribute and fight and risk their lives for the country. So the story gets more traction nowadays than it used to. So, but there are a lot of stories to be discovered about that. Siege of Richmond and Petersburg. This is the beginning of the end for the Confederacy when Richmond and Petersburg were sieged. Richmond, of course, was the capital of the Confederacy. This is Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. He was reelected because the war was on the upturn. So you can read what he said. The surrender at Appomattox. Appomattox Courthouse was actually not a courthouse, but it was the name of the town, and the surrender occurred in a guy named Wilbur McLean's house. So a lot of people think it happened in the courthouse, but it actually didn't happen in the guy's parlor. And this is it was distributed to members of the Confederate Army after the surrender. They could just go home, basically. He has permission to go home and there remain undisturbed. So it was, the terms of the surrender was that the soldiers wouldn't be punished, the officers could keep their sidearms. Here's the surrender signed by including General Longstreet, John Gibbon, and Lincoln's assassination. Shortly after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, as most of you know, President Lincoln went to Ford's Theater to take in a play with his wife, and Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, in which time he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth was on the lam for a while. So here was a poster, $100,000, which was a lot of money back then, for the capture of the murderer of the late President Abe Lincoln. And that's the end of the story. When Lincoln died, that's the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Johnson became president. Reconstruction happened. All things considered, the Civil War was a time of suffering for this country, and the suffering would continue in many ways, and the resentment and hatred continues even to this day. And the scars are still left and visible in many places. So it's been romanticized by lots of people, but I'm one of the people who I feel like people should still respect what that was. That was a terrible bloodletting and a whole lot of unnecessary death because people's inability to compromise and people's inability to be guided by morals and to accept making maybe a little bit less money. And when we think about that, how many mistakes and how much loss of life has happened over the years because of bad decisions by people whose money is at stake. That's generally what almost all wars seem to be about anyway. But nonetheless, the whole idea of the video was to show you this fought book. I studied the Civil War, and for every aspect of it, whether it's the military tactics, the personalities, the ideas, the principles, the causes, the lessons learned. I can tell you one thing though, no lessons have been learned from it. So we never learn anything from history, it seems, because everything that's happened is going to happen again. And like I've said in many other videos, the only thing that history teaches us is that we never learn. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and come back tomorrow night and we'll look at something else. Bye.